America is considered a federal constitutional republic consisting of 50 states, and it is the third most populous country with a population of 340,342,480 people, or 4.25% of the total world population, according to the latest official United Nations statistics on the population of America. Thus, America's global ranking is 3 in the list of the world's largest countries in terms of population. It is located between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and is bordered on the northern side by Canada, on the southern side by Mexico, on the western side by Russia, and on the eastern side by Canada. It also owns many lands and islands around the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean, and the United States of America is considered the most powerful country economically and militarily. And scientifically, it was the country whose citizens received the most Nobel Prizes in various fields. But what if we go back in history to the emergence of the United States of America? The story begins 30,000 years ago with the indigenous people, the American Indians, who arrived for the first time on the American continent. At that time, America was connected to the Asian continent via a land bridge called Beringia. With the end of the Ice Age, this bridge disappeared, and America was isolated by the immigrants who settled there, forming separate peoples and tribes that spread throughout the northern and southern continents and created different nations and civilizations. In the year 1492, Christopher Columbus left Spain heading to India on the continent of Asia, but he lost his way and settled in Central America. There, Columbus met the indigenous people, but he did not know that he was lost, and then he called them Indians, believing that he was in Asia and that these are the people of India already. Columbus's voyages were funded by the King of Spain. It did not take long for Columbus to realize that he was not in India but in a new land, but the naming continued as it was with the addition of the red description of the Indians due to the tendency of their skin to be red instead of the dark skin of Asian India. This insistence on renaming the indigenous people according to the vision. European-centric, as if everything that is not European is something else that was previously defined by Europe, and this shows that the Europeans not only committed crimes against an entire people, but rather renamed and redefined it completely according to a purely colonial vision. The view of the occupying Europeans towards the Native Americans varied, but they all agreed to portray them as if they were genetically degraded beings and lower in status than the English, the Spaniards, and all Europeans. This view of inferiority can be considered the preliminary condition for stripping the indigenous people of the Americas of their humanity and committing brutal massacres against them. Europeans' descriptions of Native Americans amounted to legends of zombie and vampires. For example, humanist Margaret Hudgeon tells us that the first English book about Native Americans was published in 1511 AD. He described the Indians as monsters that do not reason or think and eat each other, their wives and children. Christopher Columbus landed on the American continent in 1492 AD, and since then wars have taken place between the European occupiers and the indigenous people of the country, and the wheel of blood did not stop until the beginning of the 20th century, as corpses piled up and rivers of blood flowed. Although there are no accurate statistics about the numbers of indigenous people who were present on the lands of North America at the time of the arrival of the Europeans, some studies indicate that the numbers of the indigenous people of the Americas ranged between 10 million to 100 million in the year 1500 AD, and many specialists believe that it was about 50 million, including about 15 million from Native American tribes and clans in North America alone. The Europeans began to benefit from the vast resources of the American continent. Due to the resources of the American continent, the kingdoms of Europe turned into strong and rich empires. After that, the famous Italian traveler Amerigo Vespucci carried out many trips across the sea and reached the southern shore, currently America, and he did not see any similarity between this shore and the Indian shores, which led him to believe that he had arrived on a new continent separated from the Old World, so he named it America. The first settlement of the United States dates back to the year 1565 AD, when it was by the Spanish who built a castle in Florida. To provide protection from the Indians, the French also settled in the city of Montreal, and after that, colonial and settlement movements were carried out by the Dutch, the English, and the Swedes. The English were eventually able to control the entire eastern shore of North America, and the region was divided into 13 colonies, all of which flew the British flag, which came to represent the United States of America. From the moment the Europeans arrived, the numbers of Red Indians began to decrease at an incredible speed due to wars, mass massacres, famines, and epidemics, until they reached less than 238,000 Red Indians only with the end of the American Indian War in the 19th century. Which means that European forces slaughtered at least more than 95% of the indigenous population of what is known as the United States of America today, although some researchers believe that the total number of real deaths in the Americas may reach 300 million dead. This major extermination of the Native Americans, from 10 million people to 300 million people, was not random or a mere coincidence, but rather it was an intentional process planned by the colonists. As Klaus Conner, a professor at Princeton University, sees it, the English are the European colonial powers that practice the most for genocide. Their goal in the New World, such as Australia and New Zealand, and many of the regions they invade, is to empty the land of its people, possess it, and seize its wealth. The Spanish and Portuguese largely controlled the South American continent, while the English and French controlled the North American continent. The first English colonists began to establish permanent settlement colonies. The first was the Jamestown colony in present-day Virginia in 1607. After that, many permanent English settlement colonies arose. In 1619, it was decided to purchase the first group of black slaves. In 1620, an agreement was signed that stipulated the formation of the first self-administered government in the village of Plymouth. In 1750, settlers began arriving from Western European countries, especially England, Germany, and France. Most of them were suffering from poverty or religious or political persecution. In 1754, the 7 Years' War broke out between England and France. One of the reasons for this conflict was the struggle over the colonies and control of the resources of the North American continent between England and France. This war ended with England's victory and France gave up Canada and many of its colonies in North America. During the 18th century, features of an American society that wanted secession and independence from British rule began to appear, and the establishment of a state independent of the European empires. In fact, there was a revolution in the American settlements against the British government, the main reason for which was the refusal of the Americans to pay taxes to the British government without representation in the government. The American War of Independence from Britain began in 1775, and a Declaration of Independence was signed for 13 states from Britain in 1776 under the name of the United States of America. At that time, France was the archenemy of Britain. France was the main supporter of the Americas in their revolution against Britain, and the American forces led by George Washington succeeded in defeating the British. The British Army surrendered in Yorktown, Virginia, in 1781. In 1783, the United States and France signed the Treaty of Paris, in which France recognized the independence of the United States of America. In fact, France was the main supporter of the Americas against Britain, and the borders of the United States were recognized from Canada in the north to Florida in the south. The United States government adopted the Democratic Republic as a system of government and was influenced by the French Revolution. In 1789, George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States of America. In 1812, a second war broke out between the United States and Britain in Britain's attempt to regain its control over the United States of America. In this war, the White House, which was the center of the American government and the headquarters of the American president, was burned. But in the end, Britain failed to achieve its goals, and then an agreement was signed between Britain and the United States to demarcate the border between the United States and Canada, which belonged to Britain at that time. In 1846, the American-Mexican War broke out, in which the United States won and took control of the Southern territories. In 1862, the American Civil War broke out, one of the reasons for which was the state's rejection of the decision to prohibit slavery, which was approved by President Abraham Lincoln, which I talked about in a previous episode of its own, and you will find a link to this episode in the description. The slave trade was thriving in the southern states. They also relied heavily on slaves in agriculture, so the decision to ban slavery would cause them great losses. Therefore, the southern states separated from the northern states and became independent under the name of the American Federal States. Despite the outbreak of civil war between the northern and southern states, President Abraham Lincoln insisted on issuing a law preventing slavery. He led the war against the southern states, defeated them, and reunified the United States of America. In 1867, the United States purchased Alaska from Russia, becoming the 49th state. In 1898, the American-Spanish War broke out due to the expansion of the United States of America in the South at the expense of lands subject to the Spanish Empire. During the 19th century, the era of American dominance over global industry began. In 1914, the First World War broke out between the great European powers, between the Allied powers England, France, Russia, the Entente powers, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In the beginning, the United States had a neutral position and did not want to enter into those European wars. But the United States benefited greatly and enormously from those wars because it exported war industries, lunch, and also medicine. This war greatly revived the American economy, while the war itself was destroying the economies of the warring countries, whether the Allied countries or the Entente countries. At the end of the war, the United States of America entered alongside the Allied countries and was the reason for the victory of the Allied countries in the war. But the peace period did not last long and World War II broke out, and the United States did the same thing. It was neutral at first and benefited from the war by exporting equipment, weapons, food, and medicine to the Allied countries. The United States did the same thing it did in World War I and entered the end of the war and tipped the balance in the favor of the Allies. This time, it was England, France, and the Soviet Union against the Axis powers, Germany, Japan, and Italy. The United States ended World War II by dropping 2 nuclear bombs on 2 Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with the authorization of U.S. President Harry Truman, killing 116,000 civilians. After that, Japan surrendered. World War II killed about 55 million people around the world. It was the largest and most destructive war in history. In fact, World War II brought great benefit to America. First, the United States economy rebounded during that period. Secondly, this war greatly weakened the strength and ability of the European superpowers such as Britain, Germany, and France. It exhausted the resources and economies of those countries to the point that in the end, those countries retreated from the global arena. The arena became available for the United States, which was economically rich and was not subjected to major damage during the war. The first and second world powers to become a new superpower dominating the world. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union became the new superpowers dominating the world. The Cold War quickly broke out between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War was not an armed war, but it was an intelligence, political, and competitive war in all fields. The Cold War ended with the collapse and disintegration of the Soviet Union into 15 republics. During the 21st century, the United States became the first and only superpower dominating the world. For the first time, the term unipolar world appears.